Who decides who gets to come to or stay in Britain? Who gets the final say over how we police our borders? Shockingly, the answer no longer seems to be the elected government or our elected MPs. Time and again, we see the shots being called by unelected judges and activist lawyers. And time and again, we see foreign criminals and failed asylum seekers being granted the right to live in Britain on the most dubious grounds imaginable. In just the past few weeks and months, Britain's immigration tribunals have produced a string of judgments that will be incomprehensible to any reasonable person. There was the Albanian criminal who was saved from deportation because his son wouldn't be able to cope with eating foreign chicken nuggets. There was the Jamaican drug dealer who was also known to beat his partner. He was allowed to stay in the UK because his daughter is questioning her gender. A Congolese man who is convicted of sexually assaulting his stepdaughter was also allowed to stay because of his supposed right to a family life. Some family man that. The views and interests of the British public rarely, if ever, figure in those decisions. Worse than that, foreign criminals can now be granted asylum because of, not in spite of, the terrible crimes they've been accused of. If you're an asylum seeker who's known to persistently harass women, that might actually make it easier for you to make a case to stay in Britain. If you're a paedophile, or if you join a terror group, you could also find yourself in front of a judge who thinks that should count in your favour when applying for asylum. Back in 2020, an Afghan who'd been convicted of indecent exposure was granted refugee status. Why? Because the court believed that his sexually disinhibited behaviour and the fact he continues to act inappropriately towards females might expose him to ill treatment should he be sent back to Afghanistan. In December, a Nigerian woman who tried and failed to claim asylum 8 times succeeded on her 9th attempt, all thanks to her decision to join a terror group. She claimed to be a supporter of the indigenous people of Biafra, a proscribed terrorist organisation in Nigeria. A judge ruled that she should therefore be able to stay here because sending her back to Nigeria would land her in trouble with the authorities there. This was despite the judge noting that the woman had only joined the terror group so as to bolster her claim. A paedophile from Zimbabwe was due to be deported in 2021, but a judge blocked the proceedings earlier this year. Apparently, the man's criminal record for child sex offences, among other things, would leave him likely to face substantial hostility from the authorities in Zimbabwe. These are not just individual bad decisions. This is not just a case of a few rogue judges having the odd spasm of madness. Decisions like these invariably come from judges' interpretations of the Human Rights Act 1998, passed by New Labour, and the European Convention on Human Rights, or ECHR, which the UK signed up to in the wake of the Second World War. The so-called convention rights are treated like holy writ by our political class and the judiciary.
We will never withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights.
According to defenders of the human rights regime, to be sceptical of the ECHR is to want to turn Britain into Vladimir Putin's Russia, the only former member to have ever been fully expelled. Worse still, if you question any judgment that involves human rights law, you'll be accused of failing to learn the lessons of the horrors of Nazi Germany. This is because the ECHR's framers wanted to ensure that Hitler's crimes could never be repeated. You'll be reminded that Winston Churchill actually played a role in setting up the ECHR, because Britain's wartime PM opened the Hague Congress in 1948, which later gave rise to a range of European supranational institutions, including the Convention on Human Rights. But this narrative is absurd and misleading. While many of our vaunted human rights might sound reasonable on paper, they've been stretched and warped beyond all recognition. They've become an affront to democracy and genuine liberty and simple common sense.
The European Convention on Human Rights, safeguarding family life across Europe.
Take Article 8, the right to a family life. The aim of this was to stop the state from intruding into family affairs. Pretty uncontroversial, you'd think. The trouble is, the right to a family life is now routinely interpreted to mean that any criminal who has a child or partner in this country has a right to avoid deportation, no matter how serious their crimes. Similarly, the Article 3 ban on torture is what, in effect, allowed the Zimbabwean paedophile and Afghan sex offender to avoid deportation, because upon their return, they'd be likely to have a run-in with the authorities in their less than liberal home country. Do the judges who made these decisions really think that this is what Churchill and others had in mind? Does anyone seriously believe that depriving a pervert of a passport would put us on a slippery slope towards setting up concentration camps? The Article 8 right to a family life is currently at the centre of an explosive political row in the UK. A family of 6 from the Gaza Strip was recently granted the right to resettle in Britain. Bizarrely, they actually applied for asylum via the Ukraine Family Scheme, which was set up by the British government in the wake of Russia's invasion. But the judge said that this didn't matter. Because the family had a distant brother in Britain, this was apparently enough to activate their Article 8 rights. The fact that they had had no face-to-face contact with him for 17 years was apparently not an issue. The judgment, delivered by Hugo Norton-Taylor, an upper tribunal judge, is a masterclass in political activism. In it, he makes it abundantly clear that government policy, the will of Parliament, and the interests and safety of the British public were never going to stop him from opening up Britain's borders. The Home Office had warned that allowing these 6 Gazans to resettle in Britain under a scheme intended for Ukraine would set a dangerous precedent. It would open up the floodgates to all comers, not only from Palestine, but also from potentially any conflict zone around the world. This would fatally undermine our MPs' ability to decide asylum policy democratically. Naturally, the judge dismissed this as not a relevant consideration. He even said that the Article 8 rights of those 6 Gazans should outweigh any considerations of the broader public interest. On the question of whether Gazans should be able to make use of a scheme that was obviously intended for Ukrainians, Norton-Taylor essentially said he saw no difference between the 2 wars. He said there was no evidence of a deliberate decision by the UK government or Parliament not to include Gazans in its resettlement scheme for Ukrainians. This, apparently, gave him the leeway to effectively create his own asylum scheme via judicial fiat. So, thanks to one judge's strange interpretation of the human right to a family life, it seems the British government now has an active duty to relocate a family living 2,500 miles away to a country they have never even stepped foot in. Anyone who claims that this is a dispassionate application of the law is deluding themselves. What we've witnessed here is the imposition of a new asylum policy by an unelected judge with no regard for democracy, perhaps even with a contempt for democracy. After all, allowing Gazans to come to the UK en masse would raise several critical questions, which ought to be argued out democratically. What might it cost to resettle potentially thousands of Palestinians? Where should we resettle them? How would we go about integrating them into British society? Will they be expected to return after the war, or if the current ceasefire holds? There are also major security implications. Several Hamas-linked terror attacks targeting Europe have been thwarted since the group's pogrom in Israel on 7th of October 2023. Hamas also makes a grotesque virtue out of its willingness to hide among civilian populations. How would the government manage these obvious risks? Well, all of these considerations were blithely cast aside when the judge decided that he knew better than elected politicians and the people. The UK government has since stepped in. Even British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, usually a fanatical enthusiast for all things human rights, felt the need to distance himself from the ruling. When pressed on the case by opposition leader Kemi Badenoch during Prime Minister's questions recently, Starmer said the judge had made the wrong decision. Even this mild rebuke managed to enrage the judicial establishment. England's top judge, Baroness Sue Carr, condemned both Badenoch's question and Starmer's answer as unacceptable. According to the Lady Chief Justice, the government must respect and protect the independence of the judiciary. Elected MPs, she said, also have a duty to respect the rule of law. What Baroness Carr seems to mean by this is that judges' decisions should not be publicly questioned, that their activism in the courtroom should never be subjected to outside challenge. This is not the rule of law, as the Lady Chief Justice would have you believe. It is the rule of lawyers and judges, and it's been growing for some time. As former Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption has argued, judges in recent decades have been empowered to create what he describes as non-consensual legislation, rulings which in effect create law and bypass politics and democracy. And it's not just affecting immigration. As Sumption puts it, all kinds of areas that were once thought to be outside the purview of the courts, such as foreign policy, the conduct of overseas military operations, and other prerogative powers of the state have all, one by one, yielded to the power of the judges. And so, in 21st century Britain, judges are empowered to decide what infrastructure we can build, what energy policy we should pursue, even to set our wages. This is deeply dangerous for democracy, but it's a feature, not a bug, of our human rights setup. We need only look at the post-war origins of human rights law to see why. For while we're often told that human rights were born of a need to prevent the return of fascist or communist horrors, the framers of the ECHR had another fear at the forefront of their minds. European elites were equally terrified of the rise of mass democracy. In fact, they actually blamed democracy, ludicrously as it happens, for the rise of Hitler and Stalin. As Luke Gittos outlines in his book, Human Rights, Illusory Freedom, the existence of a human rights framework owes everything to post-war elites' attempt to exert economic and political control over the heads of European peoples. When it comes to migration today, the human rights regime has made policy almost comically at odds with public opinion. It's become almost impervious to democratic pressure. This is actually celebrated by today's elites, who view the voting masses as reactionary, racist and irrational.
You seem to be saying people who voted Brexit are stupid.
I do believe they were stupid.
I think you might have lost the argument there, my dear, if I may patronise you even more.
At the same time, can we really say that the judicial takeover of our borders has given us a more rational, humane policy? I seriously doubt that anyone accountable to voters would defend giving someone asylum because they are a terrorist or a paedophile. It's time we restored democracy and sanity to migration policy. We can be generous towards those who need our help while having no truck with criminals or those who game the system. But to get there, we must first take on the tyranny of the judiciary. Who decides who gets to come to or stay in Britain? The answer must be us.